Yeah, there. You're watching the Aussie Boom Guru, and today we're going to be having a look at creating a push button for our Revit add-in. So in this case, we're going to have a few goals today, but effectively we're recreating some of the functionality the template we began with implemented, because the original template could set up a push button. So we're going to be creating a RibbonTab, a RibbonPanel, adding a push button to that panel, and assigning a Revit command to trigger when we hit that push button. So effectively setting up our first simple command. We're going to learn about icons and tooltips in the next video, because they're a little bit more complicated, at least in the way that I recommend implementing them. It's important to note that I will be building upon the project progressively throughout this series. So if you do find that you've missed a video, I do recommend going back and making sure you're up to speed. Having said that, if you do happen to miss one, and you're comfortable to start here, make sure to copy from my GitHub, where I'll store the project status after each lesson where we build upon our project. Anyway, let's get into terminology. So the first thing we're going to be doing is creating a ribbon tab. These are those tabs you can pick from at the top of the ribbon in Revit, and we're going to make one for our add-in. As well as this, we're now going to have to define a ribbon panel, which goes on the ribbon space, and we can have multiple ribbon panels. Today we're just going to make one, but eventually we will end up with multiple ribbon panels to manage our tools and keep them together in certain spaces. Once we've done this, we're going to be creating a push button today. There are going to be other types of buttons we're going to look at later, such as pull downs and stacks, and there's more complex ones as well, like split buttons and all sorts of interesting UI components. But the push button is probably the most simple button to understand. You push it and something happens. So what do we need to do? Well, the first thing we're going to be doing is creating our add-in tab, of course, and you'll want to pick a name, ideally the name of your project. From here, we're going to add a ribbon panel to it, and then through that ribbon panel, we're going to add the push button. So we are going to need to do this in a specific order, because without the panel, we can't add the push button. Without the tab, we can't add the panel. There's going to be some related classes we're going to be working with. In this case, the UI controlled application will create a ribbon tab. Now, a ribbon tab isn't a very accessible class. In fact, we can't even access it as an object, but there are going to be ways in which we can access the panels once they're created on that tab. So it's very much going to be about how we name things when we create these components, and also how we retrieve them later when we want to do things with them. So when we have a ribbon panel, we're actually going to have to go back a step and make a function to retrieve that ribbon panel from the tab that we just created it on. As stupid as that seems, you'll get used to those things of the Revit API over time. Not everything is super intuitive. From there, once we have our ribbon panel, we're going to be adding a push button, and to do that, we're going to need to use a push button data object. So we're going to be looking at all of these classes. In fact, let's actually just look at them right now. So we begin with a UI controlled application. If you saw the last video, we currently have availability of this in our startup method. So we're going to be taking advantage of that. And we're going to be using a method that we can apply to create a ribbon tab. Now it's interesting to note that the return type of this function is void. So in this case, we can see we're returning nothing. So we can't actually retrieve that tab specifically from this function. However, what we're going to be creating is a ribbon panel. So the ribbon panel class is what we'll be working with from here. And in this case, we will be adding an item to this. So we're going to have to specifically, in this case, I believe, add a push button in this case to this. And in order to tell this add item method, we're going to have to give it some ribbon item data, more specifically, a push button data object, which inherits from this class. So we're going to be creating a push button data object. So we can see the constructor takes 4 arguments. In this case, we have a name, a text value. Now what that name is behind the scenes what the command is called, the push button itself. The text value is actually what the user sees. The assembly name we'll get to in a sec. And the 4th one is the name of the command that we want to connect to this specific class or this specific button. Once we have this push button, it's going to create a push button object. So there's various properties and methods that we can work with this. In this case, I believe there should be a few things that I think it probably inherits actually. Yeah, like things like image for example, as an icon, or tooltip is going to assign a tooltip to it. So there's lots of things we can do with this button once it exists. There's other things too, like an availability class name, which we're going to look at in future videos, that enables you to tell the button when it should be available to run. So there's quite a lot of classes we're working with. I'll try to take you through step by step so that every step makes sense, and try not to skip anything that might potentially just make it seem like you don't understand what we've just done. One really important method we're going to be using from the UI controlled application class is going to be one that actually goes and gets all the ribbon panels on the tab. So in this case, we're going to be asking a tab, give me all your panels, and we're going to work through them until we find the one that we've just created, and that will let us actually get our ribbon panel. So that's the sort of unintuitive step we're going to have to do in this process. We're also going to be using the executing assembly. So when we're running our add-in, all these classes, resources, and the code we've written are treated as an assembly that is executed by the program. So we're going to access this using a system library. So system isn't a part of the RevitAPI, it's part of the Windows collection. So in this case, we're going to use system.reflection, which will give us access to things that we don't usually get to access, but reflection's an interesting technique we'll talk about later. But this library allows us to retrieve the assembly that is currently being executed, which we will need in order to create our push button data. So we're just going to begin a demo. Most of this will be in Visual Studio today. So we're going to create a static utility class. In this case, that will let us call on our class, sort of like an object, but let us use lots of helper methods to create these. We're going to use methods because we don't want to keep writing this over and over again for each button. It's better to build something as a function or as a class if you're going to do it repetitively. As well as this, we're going to run all of these methods through the onStartup method of the application and finally test it at the end. It's important to note that I'm not currently going to be showing how you can assign icons and tooltips today. We're going to be showing a better way to do this in the next video, as well as developing a naming system that will reduce the complexity of some of the methods I'm going to create today. So if it does seem very drawn out the way I'm doing it today, don't worry, there will be a system that will make this easier. So let's just jump into our project. There we go. So in this case, you may recall we used an interface to have a startup method, and in the startup method, we have access to the UI controlled application, which will allow us to work with tab creation, ribbon creation, etc. Now, I could just go and create a ribbon panel here, but I'm going to create methods instead. So what I'm going to do is add a new folder to my project. So I'm going to go to add folder, and I'm going to call this folder utilities. So what I usually do with this is create classes that act as utility classes that are dedicated to particular types of functions. This one is going to be dedicated to the ribbon, so it's going to be ribbon utilities. So I'm going to add a new class or a new item. So I'm going to make sure I'm picking class, and I'm just going to call this ribbon_utils.cs. By default, it's not quite right. It's in the right namespace, so I do want this to sit under guru.utilities, but I want this to be a public static class. We're not going to create instances of this class. It is going to be the thing we reference specifically. But otherwise, I'm now happy with my class and I'm ready to go. So this is where we can start to build methods that belong to the static class. So the first one we need to build is the one that adds the tab or the ribbon tab to the application. So I'm just going to make this a static method because it belongs to a static class, so it also has to be static. And we're just going to return a result. So we want to know, was it successful? Did we actually create a tab or not? I'm going to call this add ribbon tab. This is the name of my method. And now we can specify the arguments that our method receives. So we firstly need a UI controlled application, which I'm going to call UI app. So we haven't really looked at methods too much yet. What I'm doing here is setting up the arguments that the method will take in order to create this tab. So we also want a tab name. So I'm going to take a string and I'm going to call this tab name. Now we need to actually specify what this method is going to do. So I'm actually going to try to create the tab just in case an error could happen, because there is chances that maybe the tab already exists by name, maybe something goes wrong. It's better that we try to make sure we catch if this doesn't work. So I'm going to use the try statement, and I'm also going to implement a catch branch as well. So we're going to try to add a ribbon tab. So I'm going to go to UI app. And now I'm able to access all the methods that the UI controlled application supports. If I'm not quite sure what I'm looking for, I can always start typing things in, and you can see it starts to limit down what is available. Maybe I want to look for RibbonPanel, and there we go. I can see I can create a RibbonPanel, and it sort of knows what I'm doing. But I actually want to create a RibbonTab, so that wasn't quite right. So if I look for tab, there we go. And this is going to try and create a RibbonTab. And if this has worked, I can just attach a return result succeeded to the try branch. So if that does work, it will return that it has worked in the function. If for some reason the tab cannot be created, it's up to us how we wish to report this back to the user, but my preference for these types of things where they're very behind the scenes is to use the debug object. So if I type in debug, this is a special thing that sort of logs errors to the output of your code back in Visual Studio whilst you work in Revit with your add-in. So you get feedback on what's going on. So in this case, I'm just going to say error. Could not create tab. Now, this might not be enough information. I mean, how do we know what tab was being created? If we just say this, it's going to be difficult for us to understand what hasn't been created. So we're going to insert a $sign in front of our string. And instead, we're going to also put in curly braces, which is a placeholder, tab name. So this will create a string with tab name as a part of the string that we output. So it's a dynamic string. Just remember the $sign is the key to make that work. And as long as these things are either string representable or they are strings themselves, they will just fill in the blanks where you provide those variables. A really useful little syntax. We, of course, also have to return result failed or result cancelled. It's up to you. But in this case, this would be a sufficient function. So now we need to actually call on this back in our application startup. So we're going to go back to our application, and I'm actually going to create a reference to this library. I'm going to call it grib for gribbon. And I'm going to say that grib is equal to guru.utilities.ribbonutils. And this now, if we say using, gives us a reference back to the Ribbon utility library. So we're going to have this static class available. So I can now say grib dot, and notice we now have this add ribbon tab available. We can see the arguments that it's expecting. So we're going to have the UI controlled application. Now I probably should go back and fix the name of that. That's not a very good variable name. So I'm going to fix that to UI controlled application. And we also need a tab name. So in this case, the tab is going to be guru. And at this point, we've created the method that will establish the tab. So that's a fairly simple one. Let's move on to adding a ribbon to this tab instead, a little bit harder. So in the same class, I can just create another method after this one. So again, public static, they're going to be the access modifiers. And in this case, we actually want to return a RibbonPanel, because the way we build this method, we're actually going to get access to a RibbonPanel object, which is going to be used further on in our code on startup to do things with the RibbonPanel, like add push buttons to it. So in this case, I'm going to say add RibbonPanel to tab is going to be my method name. And in this case, we're going to require the UI controlled application, which I'll call UI controlled app. We're going to need a tab name to add the panel to, because we can't access the tab as an object. And as you can see, it sort of knows what we're doing. It knows we want to add a panel name. So we now have 3 arguments to work with. So again, we're going to try and do this within a try catch block. So again, try catch. So what are we doing in this case? Well, this time, as we saw, we're going to use the UI controlled application. But this time we want to create a RibbonPanel. So there it is. And in this case, this actually takes 2 arguments. So there's actually different versions of this method. And the one that we're targeting in this case is the one that adds a panel to a tab. So if you cycle up and down, you'll find various overloads, as we call it. This is an overloaded method. It has different versions it supports, in this case, due to polymorphism. But what I'm going to do in this case is say to the tab, and the panel, which it now recognizes we're using that version of the method for. And this will at this point have added a panel if it works. Now, if it hasn't worked, we're going to catch that. And in this case, we're just going to debug, right line, as you can guess. And again, we're going to use a $sign to create a special string. And we're going to say error. Could not add. And we're going to use those curly braces. So we can use multiple placeholders. So that way, when this message comes back to the user, they're going to see could not add panel name to tab name, where panel name and tab name will actually be the panel name and the tab name we tried to work with. At this point, we can just return null, because RibbonPanel is a nullable class. So in this case, we can take advantage of this later. If we know that our RibbonPanel is null, then when we try to pass it through to other methods, we can first check, is that RibbonPanel null? If so, don't try to do things with it, because it's probably not going to work. Now at this point, we've tried to do this, we've got this. How do we actually get our RibbonPanel? Well, in this case, we're actually going to collect the RibbonPanels in the tab and get the one with our name. It seems a bit stupid, but unfortunately it's because we can't access the tab directly. And the return type of the create RibbonPanel method is void. So we can't actually, I believe in this case, I'm pretty sure we can't. Just checking actually, I wonder if we can. Oh, wow, maybe we actually can. Maybe that is a return type. I didn't think it was though. Let's just actually check this method. Tab string. Oh, it does return a RibbonPanel. I stand corrected. So I guess the other method, we don't actually need it in this case, but we might use it later. So we're going to create a method that retrieves a panel by name from a tab by name. So it's not actually going to get used here, interestingly enough. But if I go public, static, and we want to retrieve a RibbonPanel in this case, we're going to do get RibbonPanel by name. And this will be from a tab. So again, we're going to need our UI controlled application as an argument. We're also going to need, in this case, our tab name and our panel name that we want to get. So in this case, we're going to have to first get all the RibbonPanels. So we can just say var panels is equal to, and from the UI controlled application, we can use get RibbonPanels from a tab name. And that will get all the RibbonPanels that are on a particular tab. I'm now going to iterate over them. So you can see it's already prompting me to do a for each. So we're going to say for each panel in panels. We're going to say if the panel name, which is a property of the panel, is equal to panel name, then we know we've found our panel in this case. So we can just return our panel. So we can see that we have full reference to this variable that we're iterating across in both if statements, but also in return statements as well. Now, if we get past this, then we know we didn't find our RibbonPanel. So we can just return null instead. So because we've put a return before this, we can actually return earlier and not return null if we do find our panel. So it's a fairly complicated little function if you're new to iteration, but hopefully the lesson on statements in lesson 3 helped make that process a little bit clearer. So in this case, if for some reason I didn't think the return type would actually always return my panel, instead I can just use my get RibbonPanel by name method. So you can call on methods within a class by name. So I can actually use the get RibbonPanel by name method in here as well. So in this case, I need the UI controlled application, tab name, and the panel name. So I'm utilizing this method just up here. So you can see the flexibility of C# is pretty strong. It's quite powerful just how easy it is to work around classes and objects. So I've got a method working within another method, but I can use this later on for other purposes, which we will outside the context of this lesson. While I'm here, I'm just very quickly going to flag these so it's obvious what is what. Add tab. This is a method to create panel. And this is a method to get a panel. So now I want to go and create my general panel on my tab. So I'm going to call on grib again, and I'm going to go add ribbon. Not in this case, I actually want to add RibbonPanel to tab. So again, it's going to take UI controlled application. So the tab name in this case is also going to be Guru. The panel name in this case is actually going to be, let's say, general. This is our general panel. Now notice I'm starting to use a variable more than once. It's getting a little bit repetitive. So I can, if I want, store that to a variable. So I can say string tab name is equal to Guru. And then I can instead call on that as a variable so that I can just control it in one place, which is a little bit safer. So the next step we need to do is actually add our push button to this panel that we've just created. So what we actually are going to need to do is store the result of the add ribbon panel to tab to a variable that we can use. So I'm going to say var panel general is the outcome of that function. Now remember that if it's failed, then in this case, the function will return null. But luckily this is a nullable return type, which is expected to be a ribbon panel. So remember that in this case, the return type is ribbon panel. So we can use the var keyword because panel general knows that its output type will be return panel because of what's on the right. So the last step is actually probably a slightly more complicated one, which is to add a push button to this panel. So again, we're going to create one more method. So I'll say method to add button to panel. And we'll say public static push button will be the return type in this case. And we're going to say add push button to panel, or to ribbon panel. Now that is getting quite long, isn't it? So we'll keep it as maybe panel for now, just to keep things simpler or shorter. So I'm gonna, in this case, need some different arguments. So firstly, we actually need our ribbon panel. So I'm gonna say ribbon panel is our first argument. Our second one will be the name of our button. So button name. The next one will be the class name. We then want the internal name. So that's the behind the scenes name for our class. And we're also gonna need an assembly part. Now notice this is getting quite long, right? In C#, you can generally put things on new lines without any issue, as long as you just encapsulate or end the line, depending on what you're doing. So notice it's able to overfly onto the next line. So you can even, if you really want, just do this. If you want to really make it easy to see all the methods in your class, it's up to you. But for now, I'm just going to leave it like that. Another trick is if you go ///, it actually sets up a summary where you can describe all of those inputs. So when you hover over them, when you get context in C#, it's going to give you information about those particular parameters. So just keep that in mind. We'll probably maybe cover that in a future video. I'll just double check if there's like an easy sort of way to do this quickly. Probably not. I mean, the summary, that's what I guess the method will be described as. In the hover menu, and then each of these inputs is going to instead, in this case, need a tooltip. So I'm just double checking if we probably put it here. I think we put it between here. So I can just say, this is the ribbon panel to add to. Button name, we'll just say test. But once we go to use this method, we'll just observe the impact this has had on our method. So you can use this to decorate your method and make it easier for someone working with your code to understand what this should be doing. So anyway, let's get back to our actual code. So what are we going to do in this case? Well, remember that in some scenarios, the ribbon panel might be null at this point. So we actually want to check for that first. So I'm going to say if panel is null, then in that case, we just want to return null. And if we want, we can also do a debug. So just to save time, I'm just going to copy an earlier debug. And we're going to say could not add button name to. Now we can't, in this case, call on the panel's name because sometimes the panel might be null. So we do have to be careful there. We could also just say could not create button name, I guess. And we should hopefully have enough context on what that button name relates back to know that if it's failed, that is what we should be looking at. Now, what we need to do before we create a push button is create the push button data that we saw before. So we're just going to quickly go back to RevitAPI docs and just check that push button data class again, and just check the constructor. So it's going to need a name, text, assembly name, and class, with a reminder that name is the internal name of the button that the user doesn't see. And in this case, the text is the name of the button the user does see. We're also going to need the assembly path, which we'll go and collect in our onStartup method. And finally, the class name we'd like to connect this to, which is going to be the full class name, guru.commands. You'll see what I mean. So in this case, we're going to say var pushButton data equals. Now this is a class that we're creating an instance of. So we do need to say new pushButton data. And in this case, there's going to be some arguments we need to provide data to. So we need the name, which is going to be the internal name. We then need the button name. And we then need, in this case, the assembly name, the assembly path, and finally the class name. And this will create a new push button data object, but this hasn't yet given us the ability to create a push button. We actually need to use this now. So there's a few things we can do at this point. My preferred syntax is to add a push button data object to the ribbon panel, but use this in an if statement and make sure that it actually generated a push button. And then we can catch if it doesn't. So this is a bit of a shortcut. So I'm going to say if RibbonPanel, if panel, and we want to add an item. I think there's an add push button method, which is interesting. I haven't actually used this one. No, I think that's a bit of a different one. That's a bit more complex. We don't want to use that one. I'm going to add item. And in this case, we're going to provide the push button data object, the ribbon item data. And we're going to say it has to be a push button. Now, a trick you can use here is obviously this is only going to pass if a push button is created using the push button data. But we can actually provide access through the push button in that case as well by giving it a name. So this statement is trying to add an item with the push button data we've just specified, checking if it's a push button, and if it is, then we pass the if statement and we can use code in here. But we can also access the push button that was created by assigning it this name. So we're then going to say push button. Now there's various things we can do with this. We can do enabled, tooltip, image. Let's for now just do a testing tooltip to make sure this actually is working. There's other things we can do as well, such as set the image. But for now, I'm just going to say null, and I'm going to comment it out so it doesn't actually execute. And we're going to come back to this. So I'm just going to do large image, but we're going to come back to that later. So I'm just setting that up so that we don't forget to come back. Finally, we do have a push button, so we can return that push button. Because remember, the return type of this method is a push button. As well as this, if this wasn't a push button, obviously it failed. So I can say else, and in that case, we can just do a debug right line. And we can again just say could not create button name. So effectively, this should now satisfy. Yep, we can see that's checked out. And we're going to go and actually run this method. So in this case, we can say, var button test is equal to panel general. Actually, no, sorry. We want to go grib, and we want to add a push button to panel. And then we specify panel general as our first argument. The button name in this case, we will say is testing. In this case, I think, yeah, I've got everything the right way around. So now we need to specify the class name. So in that case, it's actually going to be the full namespace plus the command class name as well. So if we go back to application, it's going to be dot and then command test. Yep. So that's obviously a lot of stuff to write, right? So what we might do, just to keep things simple for now, is just put these onto new lines. And now the next argument is the internal button name. So I'm just going to do, in this case, testing with an underscore in front of it. And then we need an assembly path. So we haven't actually got our assembly yet. So what we're going to need to do is add a system library. And we're going to say using system.reflection, which will give us access to the assembly. So in this case, just back here, I can say var assembly is equal to assembly dot get executing assembly. So you can see that comes from system.reflection. And this will get the assembly of code that we're currently running. We also need to get the location of this assembly. That's actually the argument we're providing here to tell this where is that command coming from, which assembly is this command belong to. I'm going to say assembly path is equal to assembly.location, which is a property of that assembly. So that's a little bit of a complicated step. You don't have to technically understand what's happening there if you don't want to. It's up to you, but the important part is we're going to take that assembly path and provide that as the last argument to this method. Now, I personally find this a little bit unorganized and hard to read, so I'm just going to put these back on the same line. But in a future lesson, we are going to actually clean up these methods quite a lot so that you don't have to specify as much information about them. Because personally, I feel that's way too messy and complicated. There's so much stuff you have to write just in order to do that. So in this case, we'll say at RibbonTab, we'll say create panel, we'll say add button to panel. So I think at that point, we are technically done with the coding for this lesson, but of course we should probably actually test this out now, right? Now the problem at this point is that the test command doesn't actually do anything. It has no behavior, it just returns a result. So let's just add something that tells us this is actually going to work. So I'll make a task dialog and I'll show it. And in this case, we'll just say the title is it's working. And we'll say the main instruction, which is the message, is going to be the title of the document that we're running from. So we'll just say doc.title. So if this works, we should see the name of the Revit project that we run the command from. And that will also let us know that our UI app, UI doc, and doc variables are also working as intended. So we'll just close our Ribbon utilities and let's just try debugging. So we can either click here or we can start debugging from the debug menu. Remember that the debug configuration you're running will be the version of Revit that is opening. So in this case, I'm in debug 23, so I'm opening Revit 2023. You're going to see a window like this every time you run your add-in as a debug, but we're going to always load. You will see that every time if you're just debugging and generally testing your add-in, but once you build your final add-in, you won't see it the next time you say always load. But once we boot up, we'll hopefully have a tab. That tab will have a panel, and that panel will have a button that runs a command if all worked. We didn't get any errors in Visual Studio, so that's a very good sign, but you never know. There's still opportunities for things to go wrong when the code actually runs. Looks good, no messages, so let's just open our sample architecture project, and there we go. We can see our Guru tab has been created successfully. And on there, we can see our general panel, and we can see our testing button, and the testing tooltip has also registered. When I run it, I can see I've got a task dialog, it's working, and we can see that it tells me the name of the document that I'm currently in. So there we go, we've actually made it work. So that is, I guess, our first technical command set up for our add-in. Obviously not a very exciting command, but over the next series of lessons, we're going to build a meaningful command that will take a while to get to, but will have a lot of interesting things you'll learn along the way. So that's effectively the lesson for today. But if you're keen to learn more or see more advanced implementations of the things I'm teaching you, feel free to check out my GWiz toolbar on my GitHub as well. And if you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so. Let other people know if you think this series might help them. This is obviously a more complicated video than usual today, so if you have any questions, leave them down below or shoot me an email, but hopefully you're keeping up. And we're going to be looking at more things in the next video to extend what we've learned today. So I look forward to seeing you in future similar videos. Thanks. Take care. Bye.